Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. Before we go on any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. I'm still trying to recover my channel from the hack that happened just over a week ago. But now into the matter at hand. We've got a new solo album review of the newest project from Ed Sheeran, Equals. At some point, and I'm not precisely sure of the moment, the conversation around Ed Sheeran online just went to absolute hell. Now don't get me wrong, there are folks who have not liked this guy since the very beginning, and some of that was crystallizing around the run of Multiply, where he began to get the sustained radio traction that evades so many. But I think it really began picking up steam when Ed Sheeran got the album bomb for 2017's Divide, where it wasn't just that Ed Sheeran was present in the mainstream, he was everywhere, even on your Game of Thrones and your Heinz ketchup commercials. And in record time, Ed Sheeran seemed to become the poster boy of everything that was wrong and soulless and boring and worthless about the mainstream music industry, only intensified by his 2019 passion project, Number 6 Collaborations project, which led to even more singles that got some success and yet highlighted him fully embracing all sorts of corporate hackery. Hell, even the singles leading up to this album seem to indicate how few ideas Ed Sheeran really had left, how derivative he utterly was. And yet, while I get how and why some people came to these conclusions, they started to reach a fever pitch where I think that everyone needs to take a step back with all of this. And part of it is how I can see both the micro and the macro when it comes to Ed Sheeran in the music industry. Yeah, the most basic man in England can make decent but basic music, and it will propel him to unbelievable hype and riches on fame and inertia alone these days. But that fame does come from a real audience and fandom that might not be as online, but have actually gotten behind all the weird shifts of his career. And that's the thing, across the past decade, Ed Sheeran's music has spanned acoustic folk, to pop, to R&B, to blues, to soul, to even grime and hip-hop. And his take on all the genres comes with a distinctive artistic voice that your average everyman songwriter actually doesn't have, which you can recognize from everybody who's been trying to rip him off the past couple of years. That's the big reason why I don't really think Ed Sheeran has bad albums per se. His core competencies in song construction and composition are rock solid. His albums are at least more interesting in some of their stylistic pivots, and if you drill even a layer deeper, you'll find all manner of weird shit that reveals a much more interesting artist than he's often given credit. Now, commercial oversaturation doesn't really help for audiences that won't even go that layer deeper, and thus they'll just see a bunch of gentrified basic music by a basic artist for basic people, and then be afflicted with the terrifying fear that they will be considered basic if they wind up enjoying it. And yet I'll also be the first one to admit that Ed Sheeran doesn't quite go as deeply as he could into some of the genres that he's exploring. I mean, he's a mainstream label pop act first and foremost right about now, and that means that his albums are inevitably going to be compromised by some concessions to trends, and they don't quite bring the edge they really could. And that was my biggest issue with Divide 4 years ago, and at this point of his career, he can really get away with going further. But I've also been the guy to have had weird opinions on Ed Sheeran for years now. I never liked Sing. I think Thomas Rhett's ripoff of Thinking Out Loud and Die a Happy Man is better than the original. I actually like Shape of You, and I love Castle on the Hill and Galway Girl. I get why Ed Sheeran makes acoustic ballads, but the majority of them bore me to tears, even though I know why they work and why they're now staples on wedding playlists until the end of time. But I think his deep cuts can span from just being forgettable to among the best songs of their respective years in any genre. And you know what, I'll say it, Number 6 Collaborations project is nowhere near as bad as so many made it out to be. Yes, there were some obvious misfires, we can all point to them, but that was kind of to be expected of so many cooks in the room, and Ed Sheeran making his dream follow-up to a project he made before he even broke in the UK. And Take Me Back to London with Stormzy, that could have been a worldwide smash, really breaking grime further worldwide. I would have liked that. But heading into Equals, yeah, I knew it. The discourse was gonna suck with this, given that I was gonna be talking about the world's most ubiquitous ginger who opened up his singles run with Bad Habits. But I'll also say that Shivers is pretty good, and Visiting Hours, I'll say it again, could easily wind up among my favorite songs of any genre of 2021. But this album's already getting lit up as the easy target that it kinda is by a certain set online. Where am I landing on it? Well, you know, when I reviewed Divide back in 2017, I essentially said that Ed Sheeran is critic-proof, kind of in the same way Drake is now. He's got a lot of cultural ubiquity, too big to fail. Even if you don't like his music, he's kind of everywhere, and something might wind up sticking by osmosis if nothing else. Now, that was an assessment that was tested with the Collaborations project, which despite having an album bomb, didn't really have the right kind of staying power, in that it probably hurt Ed Sheeran's long-term reputation and his prospects more than it actually helped. But now with Equals, even though, as I expected, it was going to be a compromised project that keeps it several steps away from greatness, I don't think this is a bad album. If anything, it's probably his best since Multiply, that shows a lot more experimentation and color than I think a lot of people would expect. And yet, I guarantee there's going to be a whole swath of people who will hate this passionately because of Ed Sheeran's approach to this project, and unfortunately, we're gonna have to address and deconstruct some of that. And you know, I'm just gonna pour more fuel on the flame when I start off with a thematic parallel. There's a lot of common ground between Equals and Chance the Rapper's legendarily maligned The Big Day from 2019. In fact, there's a shocking amount of overlap, idealizing domestic bliss, a brighter, pop-friendly tone overall that with as many genre flourishes can come across as a bit of a mess, a lot of questionable mixing and production choices that can come across as too polished but also weirdly under-polished in spots, and an overwhelming sense of love-struck earnestness that to many audiences will feel overpoweringly saccharine, smarmy, and inauthentic. Now, Ed Sheeran's got the benefits of generally sharper writing in his hooks and his lyrics, as well as this being a shorter pop project in comparison with Chance the Rapper being in hip-hop, but you're going to see the same disgust in calling this a bland corporate shill of a project, because you will hear those corporate commercial compromises of more interesting sounds potentially done better. And indeed, Ed Sheeran sounds happy and settled, and that's not an attitude that really flies with disaffected online doomer nihilism. And while both Chance and Ed Sheeran kind of set themselves up for all these critiques, with Equals, it feels a little bit forced, probably because the more likely assessment is that Ed Sheeran's just settling down naturally, and that contentment is translating to his art, which can still be compelling talking about these subjects. He's a year younger than me, just turning 30, and a lot of my friends in that age range, they're getting engaged, they're getting married, and for a guy who's built his career on relatability and idiosyncratic but personal connections, it kind of makes a lot of sense that he's following the exact same arc as a lot of folks his age and mine. Now granted, that has its own unique drawbacks on both sides of this coin. On the one hand, it makes some of his attempts at more party song material feel kind of underweight in comparison with some of the darker moments on Multiply, for instance. I mean, Ed Sheeran's never been cool, but you at least got the feeling he could sell some of the atmosphere with a little bit more flair than he does here, which is another big reason I'm not the biggest fan of how much he will go to his thinner falsetto range on cuts like Bad Habits. Surprisingly, it's not one of the better songs here. But in fact, Ed Sheeran's singing in his higher register for most of this album, which is not my preference, as I said in the past, but it otherwise would not be an issue if it wasn't for some of the production. Not only is it frustratingly inconsistent from track to track, the casualty of having way too many different mixers and engineers and producers in the room, but in general, the mix, and especially some of the vocal leads, can feel really awkwardly compressed, which makes an already thin-sounding lead vocal feel even more brittle, especially with the prevalence of drum machines over having a live kit. I'm glaring right at Watt and Louis Bell specifically for two-step here, and that weirdly clipped, jerky flow of Leave Your Life. Now, I am fully aware that a big part of this is just me wishing that Ed Sheeran will fully embrace his rock side a little bit more often. He's got the full-throated, low-end rawness to do it effectively, and he's done it before, but it's also when you realize that Stop the Rain, his darkest moment on the album, picks up a bass groove reminiscent of Charlie Puth's Attention, and is an extended complaint about getting sued over copyright. I mean, don't get me wrong, the groove is actually pretty great, and Ed Sheeran sells it pretty well, and international copyright law is decades behind from where it needs to be when it comes to reform, especially in online spaces. But between the rough vocal mixing, and this being the heaviest moment on the project, and given how pissed off Ed Sheeran sounds, I mean, I can imagine why some people might find this impossible to connect with. It honestly should be better. If it was on different subject matter, it probably would be. But if anything, I found Ed Sheeran leaning a lot more on a textured late 80s, early 90s groove with a lot of the poppier dance cuts, and they actually turned out significantly better, like Collide and the Natalie Hemby co-write Love in Slow Motion, or the more upbeat wistfulness of Overpass Graffiti and Be Right Now, especially with the haze of liquid background vocals leaning even more heavily on the vocoders, which is a nice synthetic touch I think Ed Sheeran integrates quite well. The faster percussion, the blissful rollick of some of the guitars, and even touches of horns, which is their absolute apex on Visiting Hours, which again is an amazing song. But that's also why I'm a little bit baffled as to why anybody would call this a formulaic album, because alright, while the production might have some of the mainstream pop issues that I'll constantly complain about, Ed Sheeran seems to cast a much wider net when it comes to his influences beyond the whole stock romantic ballads that's been his bread and butter, of which we only get 2 on this album, First Times and The Joker and the Queen. And on that note, the former is actually sequenced bizarrely early on the project, right after Shivers and right before Bad Habits, and Ed Sheeran calls it an early breather, but it's not one that feels needed or helpful for the momentum. I'm a little surprised he was allowed to get away with it. But Ed Sheeran also opens up the album with Tides, which might be the closest thing he's cut to a Def Havana song, and it kind of reminded me how Galway Girl sounds like a Frank Turner reject, and leaving me thinking and wishing once again that Ed Sheeran's rock influences were allowed to cut loose a little bit harder. But again, they are here, and he's credible within them. But then there's Sandman. A tropical flavored cut with a marimba, a flute, and Owen Pallett of all people arranging the strings, and it's intended as a lullaby to his baby daughter frolicking with the Sandman. You know, I know it's intended to be sweet, and my mind probably shouldn't go immediately to the associations with the comic book and the Metallica song, but I did laugh uproariously thinking about how on earth he managed to get this cleared for release with Asylum and Atlantic. That is funny. But it makes for an odd quandary. You can argue that the production makes these songs feel like watered down, accessible pop flavors of existing sounds, and that the writing stays a lot more in saccharine, unchallenging territory that might fall short on the dramatic stakes, and I might partially agree with some of that. But I'll also say there's a lot of great hooks here, and moments that are too unique to Ed Sheeran's blended stylism to feel inauthentic to who he really is. The sprawl of relationships, smaller moments on Collide and Love in Slow Motion, the clumsy attempts to be a little more smooth on Two-Step and Shivers, that circle back around to actually having some accessible charm, they will go off for the right audience, and then the ex that lingers on his mind and Overpass Graffiti, where she actually got celebrated for leaving him, and that still kind of stings. And a loss of a friend, where I was admittedly kind of skeptical how much they had a connection, but with both Leave Your Life and Visiting Hours, Ed Sheeran made it feel real. That's a credit to him as a writer. But you know, I think this gets to the root of the conversation. 20 years ago, Ed Sheeran would have been getting called a sellout rather than inauthentic, and you realize that the fucking poptimism debate has never really left us after all. Just taking on a new set of clothes for specific artists. I mean, it's not remotely surprising to see Ed Sheeran on the wrong side of it. He started off in more tasteful and respectable genres like folk and grime, and now he's making mainstream pop that gets overplayed on the radio, and for the record, that's not his fault. But it feels painfully disingenuous when contrasted with pop acts who embrace far more artificiality, and they're acclaimed for it. Especially when Ed Sheeran as a writer hasn't gotten rid of some of the weird shit that stands out as unique for a basic-ass pop star. Now, if you don't like his normcore approach to the genres he's dabbling in, or you think his framing or his content are a poor fit for modern times, that's a different argument, and we can have that one. And indeed, what probably holds this album back from potentially being great are the majority of some of those production shortcomings, the compromises, and my wish that maybe he could go a little bit deeper with the songwriting, switch up the topics a little bit more, add a few more layers of nuance. Maybe it's because the compromises are so obvious on the surface that the debate just keeps coming up. Or at least for me, it is the one thing that consistently holds Ed Sheeran back from making that legit great album I think he has. But otherwise, this is fine. A couple excellent, legit high points, a couple duds. It's certainly better paced and more interesting than his last 2 projects, and it ends really strongly for me, and that's why I'm giving it a light 7 out of 10, and a recommendation. And look, at some point, it's probably worth acknowledging something for actually what it is, not what you're projecting upon it. And there's more to suggest that Ed Sheeran is just a pretty basic guy making pretty good, if unchallenging, basic pop music that's broadly accessible because the majority can relate. Woo. And projecting onto this album discourse on authenticity, poptimism, or late capitalism in the mainstream music industry. I mean, I get where you're coming from, but pick your battles. It feels like a reach here. I mean, it's not cool to praise or like this, but both Ed Sheeran and I are the same age. Clear he and I both stopped caring about the veneer of cool a long time ago, but I think we might be better for it. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, again, I would be extremely grateful. Still trying to recover from that hack, and we're on the right path to getting there, and I'm seeing some real traction. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Comments are down there. Have fun. I've actually got a couple more solo reviews planned to pick up the volume, and actually a couple albums I'm really excited to talk about that I think could be among some of the best of this year. But if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or get into my Discord to yell at me about various things, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated to join. I'll be fine, but option is available and always appreciated. Until then, though, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.